Our first speaker this morning is a gentleman named Glen Martin, and he has for 2 decades been building a legacy of reentry programs and criminal justice reform. Like many of us, a lot of his passion is rooted in his own life experience, having spent 6 years locked up in New York on an armed robbery charge. And so that kind of launched him in this career path, and like half the people in the room here. So, you know, I don't imagine he gets introduced a lot right off the bat by being, he's a convicted felon. But he's in good company in this room, so I feel right at home doing that here. So the early part of his career was invested. Whoops, we got to fix these next year. It's all right. I'll behave and keep my hands off the podium. I'm sorry. The early part of his career was invested in the Legal Action Center and Fortune Society, which are both nonprofits that provide reentry services to returning citizens. And while he was at the Fortune Society, he co-founded the Education from the Inside Out Coalition. And that's an advocacy group that is striving to advance educational opportunities both for current inmates and returning citizens. So he's been involved in a lot of this stuff. In 2014, Glen founded Just Leadership USA, and that's an advocacy and training organization that's dedicated to cutting the incarcerated population in the U.S. in half by 2030, and that is an admirable goal. In 2018, he founded GEM Trainers, which trains and develops nonprofit leaders and organizations. You know, Glen is not the kind of guy with whom you want to get in the way. He's kind of a freight train, moving from one thing to another and founding organizations. So we're going to keep this going. He added a couple of years later GEM Real Estate, which is an investment and development company. It kind of makes me tired just listing all of the things that he started and founded, but that's why he's here today. So he's been collecting various awards for his work almost annually since 2007, and along the way he was also instrumental in the movement to close the notorious Rikers Island facility where he spent the first year of his incarceration. So before I get dizzy from my head spinning and all the things that he's accomplished, let me turn the podium over to Glen, and he's going to take the next hour to tell us everything he knows about starting organizations that he's learned over 20 years.
Meant to movement. And that's something I do know something about. So I was asked to talk about, in particular, not just how to build organizations and build movements, but how to recognize that there's a group of folks that are carved out of the larger criminal justice reform movement. And believe it or not, because my career goes back 20 plus years, I have an analog for that conversation. And I'll take you through my life journey, and I'll do a bit of storytelling, because that's something I can do up here on this stage. I don't know the content of your issue. I'm not an expert, but I am an expert on my own journey, and I'm going to do a little bit of storytelling. So when I looked back at that email with the introduction and talking about marginalization, another light bulb went off for me. And not only do I know something about movement building, I know something about being marginalized. I know something about being dehumanized. I know something about being villainized and canceled. I know something about how human beings respond to people they hate. And I know something about how advocates negotiate against themselves by carving out populations that they think are going to get in the way of some sort of win. I know how advocates are heavily motivated by philanthropy and what philanthropy wants. I know that advocates can be hugely transactional. I know that at the 11th hour, people sit in front of policymakers and make decisions about who's not coming along on this trip. I've been doing this for 22 years. I know a lot about that. So what I'm going to try to leave you with today, just so that there's some structure to my talk, is a conversation about the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. So when I listen to people talk, I usually spend the first few minutes wondering exactly who they are, and that was a very generous introduction. I appreciate it. But let me sort of add to that, so you're not spending too much time wondering who this person is, and you get a sense of who I am as a human being. Someone else approached me today and said, I follow you on Twitter, and what I really love is that you don't just talk about the issues you care about, but you really inject who you are as a human being. And I think there's not enough space in the criminal justice reform movement for people to do that. In fact, I think we lionize our leaders in a way that doesn't create space for them to talk about their own fallibility, which to me diminishes the movement and harms the movement. The whole point we do this work is to recognize that human beings show up in all sorts of ways. Depends on the day of the week, the month of the year, and I feel as though we sort of don't create room for that. So a little bit about me. Yes, today I'm an entrepreneur, which is sort of strange to be on a stage talking about myself that way. I own 90 plus properties in Georgia and Alabama. That started 3 years ago. It's a little different for me. The reason I launched into entrepreneurship in this way is I have a healthy disdain for philanthropy. And when I'm on stage, I want to say what I want, when I want, and I don't want a phone call from a funder telling me what I can and cannot say, which is something I've had to experience in my life. And so building a $10 million real estate portfolio in 3 years was a little bit of a FU to foundations. Yeah, and you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about when my career hit a brick wall a few years ago. And it was in that moment that people who saw me as the poster child one day, the next day villainized me. And I couldn't talk to the program officers anymore. I had to talk to their lawyers and so on. And we'll get to that. I actually look forward to telling that story publicly for the first time. And then I have the nonprofit consultancy business. And that's been fascinating because it's one thing to build a nonprofit and to run a nonprofit, but I'm sort of in a different place now, and I get to see the field differently. I've had about 50 plus clients. I have 8 or 9 subcontractors that work for me. We do everything from crisis management to organizational development to fundraising to social media, you name it. But it gives me a perspective on the field that's a bit different. And some of the takeaways, for instance, is how much people are hurting in this space as they're doing the work. That there's not enough space for healing, not enough space for people addressing their own trauma, not enough space for honest conversations about how the field gets involved in what I call lateral violence, harming each other, like feeling frustrated about people who are really creating oppressive situations that is so difficult to reach, and instead realizing it's so much easier to harm the person next to you or close to you. There's a lot of that happens in our space. And that has become more and more evident for me as I've had the chance to move through the space differently, and to see the space differently, and to deal with so many different leaders who have very similar stories about their pain going through the space. I do a lot of traveling these days. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My family is from the Caribbean, Grenada, a small island called Grenada. I was born in Brooklyn. 2 brothers, one older, one younger. My younger brother's Adam. Spent much of his life in and out of jail. Still smokes a lot of weed. But he's an electrician who smokes a lot of weed. I'm not sure if that goes together. Love my brother, though, but he's had a difficult life. And, as a young black man who grew up in Bed-Stuy, I'm just glad that he's alive and he's thriving and he's doing his thing. I have an older brother, Sheldon. Sheldon went into the Navy when he was 17, and that was just a game changer for him. Met new people, visited new cultures, new religions, new countries, and so on, and that really expanded his world. And he was very successful by many stretches of the imagination, and ended up in San Diego, California. Never really came back to where he grew up. I think for him, where we grew up represented suffering and pain and poverty, and he really wanted to stay away from that once he found himself out of that space. And then he grew up to be a federal correction officer, and then a U.S. Marshal. Thanksgivings are fucking awesome. I love him too, though. I love him too. Actually, it's really important that, having a white father and a black mother and a brother who grew up to be in law enforcement and a younger brother in and out of prison and all the things I've been able to do in my career, it gives me a very unique approach and perspective on this work. And when I talk about Just Leadership USA, it'll help people understand why I built it the way that I did. But sort of being able to try to hold on to the multiple perspectives that exist in this country by virtue of my own journey, my own family, my own experience, has been really important in my success. And I'm actually going to share that with you as you think about your work and your success. So I went to Rikers when I was 16 for shoplifting. At that time in New York, if you were 16 years old, you got charged as an adult. And if you know anything about Rikers, you have 2 choices, predator or prey. It is a very scary place to be for an adult man, much less a 16-year-old child. And there were many other children there. I remember walking into a cell block and looking out and seeing 60 other children like myself. Many of them I recognized. And I remember saying to myself, is this what New York City has for children who get it wrong? Like, is this the response to shoplifting? And the judge gave me $1,500 bail. And when you're poor, I was poor, we were poor, $1,500 might as well be $15 million. It felt like ransom. When you're poor, if you have $1,500, guess what? You spend $1,500. You don't have it sitting around the bank. And so I remember being trapped there for a couple of days, and a few days later I had another court date, so I'm on my way back to court, and I'm sitting in a cell, and there's about 30 of us in a cell about the size of the rest of the stage here. And another child walks over to me and he says, give me your jacket. Predator or prey? You only have 2 choices. And I jump up and we start fighting because you have no choice. And in the middle of the fight, it felt like it went on forever, but within seconds probably, I realized I was fighting 5 or 6 young guys. And then a few seconds later, I could feel blood coming down the side of my neck. And I realized I was actually being stabbed by one of them with a plastic pen that was melted into a knife. And the correction officers came over and they broke it up and they took guys out and they put them in different cells. And I remember this being the most humiliating and difficult part of it, the part I remember the most, which is the correction officers laughing and joking. And then they took me out the cell and sat me down and said, if you tell us who did it, you're not going to be able to live here on Rikers. So I just want to give you that warning. And you won't go to court today if you see medical attention this morning. So who doesn't want to go to court and see if they have a chance to go home? So I remember taking a bunch of paper towels and putting it on my neck here. You can almost still see the scar when I turn to the left. And then there's one in the back of my head and two in my back. But the things that happen to us when we're young really shape who we become in the world as we get older. And the way I can sort of remember that story really graphically in detail, what I was wearing, what the cell was like, what the smell was like, how the officers engaged me, how it made me feel, has a lot to do with who I became as an adult, and how I showed up as an adult. So from there, I went back to the streets because the lesson I learned was that if that's the worst New York has for me, I survived it, and I could probably survive it again. I didn't become prey. So if I came back, I could just be predator and I could make it here. And I went back to the streets and I kept committing crime and things got more and more serious. And then I got locked up for robbery and I was facing 20 to 40. Except this time I had some money and I bought a private lawyer. And you can buy justice in this country if you have enough money. And so 20 to 40 became 3 to 9 and I served 6. And I did the first year on Rikers. And I owned the whole cell block because I knew how to live on Rikers. I knew how to be just tough enough to be able to survive on Rikers. That's what Rikers had turned me into. That's what the streets had turned me into. And yet, there were some moments that I remember till this day that I thought they were great moments. We used to play this game called Johnny Rides the Pony. Anyone ever heard of this game? So it's like football with a bunch of metal around to hurt you. And 7 or 8 guys go on that side, 7 or 8 guys go on this side. The guys on this side are standing up, prepared to go sort of running down the cell tier. The guys on the other side are leaned over each other, grabbing each other by the waist, the pony. And the guy on this end runs, puts his hand on the back of the first person, tries to fly up in the air as far as possible, and land as heavily on the pony, and the idea is to crush the pony. If the pony stays up and carries all 7 guys from this side, they win, the game switches over, et cetera, et cetera. I still have scars from Johnny Rides the Pony. I got black and blues on my legs today from Johnny Rides the Pony, but I bring up that story to say this. In the middle of a place where, like, in a second, people could be stabbing each other, killing each other, harming each other, cutting each other, that there was still humanity there. There was still love there. There was still compassion there. There were still children there. And I think that's something we forget, even as we do this work. Sometimes even the most progressive folks are willing to separate people out and define them and put them in boxes to get the work done. I'd like to think I'm on this stage because I try not to do that. I'd like to think for most of my career I've tried not to do that. Because I always remember those guys were charged with all sorts of crimes. Burglary, robbery, murder, sex-related offenses. Didn't matter. We had fun playing Johnny Rides the Pony. I didn't care what they were there for, except that I did worry about how much time some of them were going to do. But whatever they did to get themselves there wasn't as important as who they were. Like who they were as human beings, who they were as children, what I got out of them in a moment of despair in my own life, a moment where I had to be the most violent person I've ever been in life. It was actually important for me to have people around me to remind myself of my own humanity. And that's part of what they did for me. So I go on to prison, and it was fascinating, actually, because in Rikers, it's all about survival, all about trying to get your hand on a piece of metal that you can turn into a weapon to protect yourself. And then I got to prison, and the first thing I saw is there's a guy sitting there opening a can of tuna fish. And I'm looking at the lid, and I'm thinking, I got to get my hands on that. And I can't even believe he has a can of tuna fish. And he takes the lid off, and he just tosses it in the garbage, and he eats tuna fish. And I realized suddenly that, okay, I'm not going to spend the next 6 years fighting for life the way I did on Rikers. And and that there may be some opportunity here. And this correction counselor, of all people, walks over to me after giving me this orientation test, and he says to me, "Wow, look at your grades." He said, "You should go to college." And I'm like, oh, this guy's fucking with me. Like, I'm in prison. I should go to, yeah, okay, I should go to. First time anyone had ever said that to me, by the way. First time. And he sends me 10 hours away from New York to Attica Correctional Facility. And I find out there's a college program that was founded decades earlier from people in prison who actually sacrificed, some of them, their lives for that college program to exist. And here I am in prison, going to college, earning a quality 2-year liberal arts degree, sociology, religion, psychology. In some ways, being freer in prison than I ever was in the society I grew up in. But more importantly, the college experience, not just the credential was going to be important, but the experience, the networking, the studying together, the helping other people to prepare for an exam. Like, that was as important to me as a college experience as anything that would have happened here for me on the outside. I remember meeting a guy named Howie in the college program. Howie had been there 22 years, and he was really the administrator of the program. If any of you have been to prison, and I hear half of you have, that was a joke. Just to cue up the laughs. Like, in prison, you know that the people who are serving time really end up running the programs. And he really did run the program, this guy, Howie. And, you know, he was white guy, blonde hair, ponytail, like just, no, in the community I grew up in, if you were white, you were a police officer, you were a fire person, or you were a teacher. And so me creating this bonded relationship with this guy, Howie, was pretty fascinating. He taught me computers, not just how to use computers this way, but how to take them apart. We only had 7 of them, so we had to fix them when they broke and switch parts around and so on. Gave me a really deep understanding of how computers work, literally, from the inside out. But also taught me yoga in the yard. And, you know, you really can't assemble in prison yards. You can't have more than 4 or 5 people together, but we'd sit sort of far apart from each other enough that they couldn't define us as being in a group, and Howie would teach us yoga from far away. But I'll never forget Howie for that. I'll never forget who he was, his humanity, his giving nature, and I'm going to get back to Howie in a second. So I come out of prison, I'm looking for a job just like anyone else, and I visit about 50 different employers, and I get turned down over and over and over again based solely on the criminal record. And I quickly realized that even with the college degree, even with all of my interests in doing the right thing and staying out of trouble, that I was going to have a difficult time finding a job. And I realized that the criminal record was going to be a bit of a scarlet letter, or at least society would have it be that way. And I met a guy named George Leno, who, if he was sitting in this room today, I'm not sure I'd recognize him, but I remember his name, and more importantly, I remember what he did for me. He said, "I'd served time in prison many years ago. I came home. Took me a long time to get my life together, but I got it together, and I'm going to do the same thing for you. I'm going to stick with you until you find a job." And that meant he came to my house banging on my door in the mornings to get me up. Because as you know, all the motivation in the world can really dissipate quickly when it feels like the world is crushing you and telling you that you have little to no value. And he knew that because he had already taken that journey. He knew that. And he stayed on top of me, and he got me a job at the place called Legal Action Center. It was a nonprofit public interest law firm. They have offices in New York, offices in D.C. They're pretty small, about 32 people, small budget, been around for a long time, founded by Arthur Lyman, counsel to President Reagan many years ago. Doug Lyman, his son, was still on the board, producer, director, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Born Identity. Pretty amazing organization to work at, with a bunch of civil rights attorneys that have been doing the work for many years. And here I am, answering the phone at the front desk, making $16,000 a year. It was 22 years ago. I live in New York. That's still not a lot of money. I'm just saying. Um, Very nonprofit-ish of them to pay me that much. Um, but I had a job, and I was around really smart people, and there was opportunities to grow there. And I learned a lot. And I remember going from front desk receptionist to training coordinator to paralegal to deputy director of the National Hire Network. Hire stood for helping individuals re-enter through employment, to co-director of the Hire Network before I left after 6.5 years. But I remember the first time I had a chance to do policy work. Policy just sounds so fancy. I didn't know what nonprofits were. I didn't know about fundraising. I didn't know about policy advocacy, organizing, activism, you name it. I didn't know about all that stuff was pretty foreign to me. But I understood my moment when I was actually doing policy work because I was brought into a meeting with the head of parole in New York State. And I'm sitting there and the lawyers are discussing bills they're trying to pass and things that parole can do internally to change policies, like not saying I can't associate with another person with a criminal record, or not making it more difficult for me to live just because I switched parole officers. Now suddenly I got to come in the house at 7 o'clock and all this sort of stuff. And then when it got around to me, the head of parole was like, well, Glenn, you literally are on parole. What would you do differently? And I was like, well, look, there's a lot of things I could say, but I have a job. I work 50 hours a week, and then I go see my parole officer, and the office is jam-packed, and I have to wait. And I was like, I'm working. It would be great if they recognized that and saw me early or gave me an appointment. But also, if I'm going to sit in that waiting room, like put some computers in the waiting room, like make it make sense. Like give me something to do. Don't tell me I can't have my children there. You say you want me to reconnect with my family. I can't have my kids there. Don't tell me I can't have my cell phone on. Like you say you want me to have a job, I can't have my cell phone on. Like everything you're doing feels antithetical to what you say you want to create as an institution. And the next day, literally the next day, I got a phone call saying that they were purchasing computers to put in every single office of parole all across the city. But that's not the moral of this story. During the meeting, I heard one of my colleagues talking about a policy they wanted to change, and my colleague said, yeah, we're not talking about people with violent crimes, though. We're talking about non-violent first-time drug offenders. I was like, who are those people? Because I don't remember serving time with those people. And so here I am, like shaking my head yes, like a bauble doll, because I want this job, I need this job. They must be smarter than me. They must know what they're talking about. But then thinking about Howie, thinking about the guys that I played Johnny Rides the Pony with, like really, was I saying that? Was I saying fuck them? Or is there another story to be told about how we all move forward together? And so this is not it's not an indictment of the Legal Action Center, but it is sort of the evolution of my journey from going from sitting in that room and shaking my head yes like a bauble doll to the way I show up today. And I'm trying to get you guys to get to where I am today really quickly. And I think you guys understand it better than anyone else. But I'm going to take you through another part of my journey, Fortune Society. So I leave the Legal Action Center. Why? Great job. I'm getting paid $75,000 a year now. I'm running one of their largest projects that I helped to create. I got a criminal record, so I'm not sure I could even find a job anywhere else. As you know, you can have a great job one day and go to McDonald's the next day and be in trouble, not be able to be hired. But because I wasn't going to go to law school, I felt very disconnected from other formerly incarcerated people. And I didn't want my experience to be the only experience I was relying on. Like I wanted my voice when I show up in rooms with policymakers to be informed by other people who were just coming home. I didn't even know if the experience of someone coming home 6.5 years later was the same as mine 6.5 years earlier. And so I couldn't stay at the Legal Action Center because I just was not engaging people who were coming home every day. So I went to the Fortune Society, an organization that's been around for 40 plus years at the time. And I said to them, if you give me a job to build out your policy advocacy work and pay my salary for a year, in a year I will have raised enough money to do my own work and to build out this unit. And they did it. And during that year, I not only built out the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, named after its founder, but I took over fundraising for the agency. I took over communications and marketing, and I took over one of their programs. And grew the agency from $10 million to about $22 million budget. But more importantly, did a lot of really good policy advocacy work that was designed, informed, and led by formerly incarcerated people who were coming through the door of that organization. Because I believe that people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but often furthest from power and resources. And yet I learned my lessons there too. And here's one of the biggest lessons I learned. I learned that if your organization is 80+% government funded, then you start behaving like government. And there were many things about the way they showed up that made me realize that I was hitting a brick wall in terms of the more ambitious things I wanted to do at Fortune Society. And again, everyone plays their role. It's not an indictment, but it's just a reality of my experience there and part of what inspired me to move on. But a couple of things happened. I worked on Rockefeller drug law reform in New York. So we have these notorious drug laws in New York that go back to Governor Rockefeller, and they were mandatory minimums for people who get convicted of drugs. And I remember doing that work, one of the proudest things a lot of the staff members at Fortune would say was, we're talking about drug offenders. We're not talking about people with violent crimes. We're not talking about people with sex offenses. We're talking about people who have sold drugs and gotten in trouble, and they shouldn't be in prison. Howie shouldn't be in prison either. So I also worked on Pell Grants, reinstating Pell Grants. I went to prison a year after they were taken away, so college programs went away. I was in a program that was privately funded, plus they saved money from when they did have Pell Grants. So I benefited from that, though the program was a skeleton of what it used to be. There used to be 120 people in the program. At that time, they were about 28. So I always, I worked with Dallas Pell, the daughter of Senator Claiborne Pell, on trying to bring Pell Grants back. Took us 2 decades, and maybe some of the people in this room were responsible for making it happen. Right in the middle of the pandemic, it happened. But I went to go visit Jeff Sessions. Yes, that Jeff Sessions. And I was in his office, and I was going to use every skill set I had to try to convince Jeff Sessions to do something different. I'm a dreamer. And I do what I normally do, which is to sit there and talk about policy and talk about what's important to people and what works and what doesn't work and research and data and so on. And then I slip in that I did time in prison. And I did that with him. I waited till the end of the conversation. I said, Senator Sessions, I just want to let you know, I served time in prison. I benefited from a 2-year quality liberal arts degree. As a result, I'm able to do this work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he just said, no, not you, Glenn. Not you. Not you. And he had that sort of back and forth for a while. I've experienced that in other places. And then he just clicked, and he looked at me and he said, yeah, but I'm not going to change a policy just because a blind squirrel finds a nut. And so what he was doing was exceptionalizing me so that he doesn't have to do anything. And I've experienced that over and over, and that goes back to the top of my conversation about the importance of not building a movement that's all about the charismatic front of the room leader, because what you actually do in that moment is to actually reinforce the narrative about everyone else. Of course, one person made it. That doesn't mean the rest of them are good people. Every once in a while, a blind squirrel's going to find a nut. And at Fortune Society, I was that blind squirrel. So I had to leave. I had to leave because the more people talked about me as the exception, is the more it reinforced all the negative messaging about everyone else. And so people look at me and say, you're exceptional. Maybe there's some things about me that are exceptional, like everyone else in this room. But I've really been exposed to exceptional opportunities. That is primarily what makes me exceptional. And that is why I built Just Leadership. I was like, wait a minute, can I take all this, package it, and expose other formerly incarcerated people to it for a number of reasons. One, this is an issue about the dehumanization of human beings. Like, you don't put people into the places we put them if you think of them as people. If you think of them as inmates, convicts, offenders, prisoners, all the other words we use to try to dehumanize them, then you can do whatever you want with them. If they're not my uncle, my aunt, my sister, my brother, my child, my nephew, my niece, then yeah, you can put them in that hole that's dark for 23 hours with no light. You can do whatever you want. So how do we take an issue where people are dehumanized, rehumanize them, and move them from the margins to the center? You invest in them. You invest in those people to have voice and to not have fear, because fear is a big part of it. I was the guy with the violent crime. I was the guy sitting in that office with parole saying, yeah, let me not say that I'm the guy with the violent crime, because we're here to talk about the nonviolent first-time drug offenders. You guys see any parallels yet? I was scared. I'm sure sometimes some of you are scared. Half my career was sort of bogged down in fear of speaking up just about the type of crimes I had. And then there was another moment at Fortune before I move on to Just Leadership fully. I got on the phone to do an interview with Geraldo Rivera. Who starts a story that way? Like, half of you have to be saying that was your first mistake. And I get on the phone to do this interview, and we're live on the radio, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Glen Martin to the program, who wants to take your hard-earned money, rip it from your wallet, and give it to rapists so they can go to college. And you know what he was doing? He was giving me bait to say, no, that's not what I'm saying. That's what he was doing. Most people in the criminal justice reform space would have taken that bait. And I actually said to him, I said, you know what, I'm glad you started out talking about money. Let's talk about money. Let's talk about how much money we spend, blah, 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 blah. By the time it was over, he was like, I'm going to give Glenn the last word. Because I was ready for that shit. But more importantly, I just refused. Even if you just look at it strategically, even if you don't believe Glenn is this compassionate person he's saying he is, has this heart, has courage, even strategically, why would I start out negotiating against myself? Why would I start out saying there's some population of the people I care about that you're right, like let's leave them out? I like to win. You know that. I like to win, right? You said that. I like to win. I like to get it right. I like to build things. I don't like to lose. So take everything else away. Strategically, it just makes no sense. So I get to Just Leadership, and I start out saying, part of the problem in this field is that it's mired in mediocrity. It doesn't match what I want to see happen for the guys I played Johnny Ride the Pony with. It doesn't match what I want for Howie. Like, this movement just feels too marginal for me. Like, the movement feels too slow, too lethargic. Like, our criminal justice system is moving 100 miles an hour, consuming human beings, creating all this darkness, and us, the folks who are meant to move it back in another direction, I felt weren't being bold enough. And so I started out, after walking away from 180 grand a year, sitting on my balcony in Harlem, 13-page concept paper about Just Leadership, no money coming in, no grants. I was like, Glenn, at this moment, you literally have nothing to lose. You've already made a hard decision to walk away from stability and everything. You might as well knock it out the park. And I said, you know what? Half by 2030. And my son Joshua, who's going to be 18 in 2030, and 1 out of 3 black men go to prison before they're 18, he was running around the house in his little pajamas, and I snapped a picture of him, and I took that picture and I put it in an email, because I knew to wake up every day and run Just Leadership, I knew I was going to need for it to be really personal. And when you think about Joshua being 18 and having such a huge chance of being locked up in this country, That made it personal for me. And I sent out a picture of him, and I talked about just leadership, and I talked about half by 2030. I didn't have any money yet, so I was just sort of faking it. I was like, yeah, I built this organization, and we're going to train formerly incarcerated people, and we're going to cut the prison population in half by 2030, and we're going to have a national membership. And I send it out to like 10,000 people. I collect names. When I meet people, I keep cards. I have a huge listserv. So just pressing send alone was scary as hell. And then one of the first people to call me was Michelle Alexander. And she said, hey, Glenn, I saw your email. And she said, you know, I got to tell you that Van Jones and I are building a similar organization, and you might actually want to not do this because we might end up overshadowing what you're doing. And I think she thought she was calling from the right place. But if there's anything scarier than sending out an email and making a pronouncement to the world about cutting the correctional population in half by 2030, it's Van Jones and Michelle Alexander calling you right afterwards and saying maybe you shouldn't do that. But here's what I knew I had that they didn't: the power of people directly impacted by the issues. So they might have had the money, they might have had the celebrity, and again, I think their interest was in the right place. Van is a very close and good friend of mine. Picked up on that? Some of you did. Michelle's okay. And so I started building Just Leadership, and I talked about half by 2030, and some of my own colleagues were telling me, you're out of your mind, there's no way, there's no way. And I started investing in formerly incarcerated people, some of them in this room. Glad you guys benefited from Just Leadership USA. That was part of the point. Me being on the stage today is part of the point. Like, you guys might remember, I always said to people, they say, what do you want us to do now that you've trained us? I'd say, go out and do something more amazing and more courageous than what I did. That's the point. It's not for me to deploy you like soldiers. It's for you to find the courage and the experience and the connections and the networks and the wherewithal to go out and build something even more amazing. I feel like I'm sitting in a space of something that feels pretty damn amazing. Tens of thousands of members all across the country. And then we said we were going to close Rikers. I remember I was on a stage at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and it was the first time I said that out loud. And I was in a room with about 300 of my colleagues that I had already known for about 10 or 12 years. And I never forget, one of them came up to me at the end, really powerful woman who had been running a reentry organization for years. And she pulled me to the side and she said, you should never say that again. She was like, you're going to ruin your career. She was like, no one's going to want to close Rikers. She was like, it's not the right thing to do. Do you understand how many of these reentry programs provide services there? How many millions of dollars we get to provide supports there? Like, I want you to be successful, but that is just way too ambitious. A year later, we brought the mayor to his knees, who said, yes, we're going to close Rikers. Why? Because formerly incarcerated people led the way. Formerly incarcerated people and their families, people who love them, people who care about them, led the way. I will never forget a moment where the mayor was going to one of his fundraisers, and we were bird dogging him all over the country. He couldn't do a fundraiser without us showing up. And one of my guys, formerly incarcerated, is standing in front of the mayor, and the mayor, who's like 7'1", 7'2", allegedly progressive, although I spent $4 million making him a little bit more progressive, looks down at my guy and he says, yeah, we're going to do everything we can to fix Rikers. And my guy looked up at him and said, no, we're going to do everything we can to close Rikers. Because there's some other people that would have said, yes, Mr. Mayor, yeah, we're going to work with you to make it a better place. We're going to put lipstick all over that pig. That's not what my guy who served time there said. My guy worked in 42nd Street, sweeping up the streets, formerly incarcerated guy. That was his day job. But he was going to organize all over the place, do whatever it takes to get Rikers closed. And when the mayor finally confronted him, I don't know where it came from. I don't care where it came from. But it reinforced everything I believe about people who are directly impacted by an issue, bringing something to the table that is not just powerful for themselves and for the movement, but for other human beings who may never be impacted by an issue to better understand why that issue is so important. Just leadership. So I build Just Leadership, spend a year. How much more time do I have? 30 minutes-ish? 30 minutes. So I build Just Leadership, spend a year, start raising some money, build a curriculum, did a bunch of stuff before I actually sort of launched it and found leaders to come show up in New York and all the things they experienced there. And we knew we were going to do a lot around storytelling because storytelling is powerful. And every human being has the ability to do just that. Like I'm on this stage, I'm winging it, just telling stories. I don't know anything about your policy or your data. So we told people they should come there prepared to tell their story. Just 2 minutes. Tell a couple of minutes of your story so that we get a sense of your ability to tie your story to policy reform, but also so that people in the audience can hear you and know who you are and get to know you. And first day, first meeting, first session, first hour, a guy gets on the stage. I'm going to change his name. His name is Lance. It's not really his name. And the first sentence out of his mouth is, 12 years ago, I had sex with my daughter. And the room, you could have heard a pin drop. And you could feel tightness. I could feel tightness, if I'm being honest. Felt tightness in my stomach. Felt scared. Didn't know what was going to happen next. He told the rest of his story. He got off stage. Other people got on stage. And we took a break. And I could just feel the energy. People were out in the hallway. People were gathered. People were having conversations. And then a black guy from Chicago walks over to me and he says, Glenn, he was like, he got to go. He got to go. Either he's going to go or I'm going to go. He's got to go. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. And I went over to David Mensa, who was my leadership trainer, but also my personal coach for many years before that. And I was like, David, let me talk this through with you, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. And by the time I finished talking to David, I knew what I needed to do. Because I had spent all this time building this organization, all this time thinking about it. In many ways, this organization was the culmination of all of my work up until then. I had raised all of this money. I even had foundations who told me, maybe you shouldn't start with people with the most serious cases. And I went back over to the black guy from Chicago, and I was like, you're going to have to go. I was like, you can reapply next year, but you're going to have to go. And Lance, who stayed in the program, by the end of that session, 3 days later, they loved him. They were calling him Brother Lance. When I look at his work today, it reinforces that I made the right decision. He's an amazing human being. We've stayed in touch, just salt of the earth. And more equally importantly was like his willingness to stand there on stage and tell his story, I believe, moved the other 34 people, minus Lance, he went back to Chicago, but moved the other 34 people to a place of just more courage and sort of a different way of thinking about the work and more boldness and more acceptance. Because those folks, men and women in prison, learned all the wrong things about how to engage people who have sex offense convictions. Except everything you learn in prison to survive are the things you fail with in society. And so we did have some work to do to help people unlearn those things. But Lance, he really moved people forward exponentially by doing that. I would argue he also opened up the door for other people with sex offenses to apply and to join Just Leadership and to come in and be part of the community. And that's an important thing because going back 20 years to the violent crime piece, that's what it took. It took for people like me, a guy named Eddie Ellis, a guy named Divine Pryor, and a bunch of other folks who had violent convictions to say, you're not going to leave us out of this movement. You don't have a movement without us. Your movement doesn't have legitimacy without us. You can't stand anywhere and say you believe in the fallibility of human beings and the ability for them to restore themselves and restorative justice and leave us out? Yeah, nah. Like, I'll make sure you don't have legitimacy. Take the lessons. Take the lessons. Like, showing up and sort of opening the door for other people to come behind you, like the courage it takes to do that, because that's when courage is like the most important, when your knees are shaking, when there's something you can lose professionally or personally is exactly when you should stand up and speak. I understand it is a bold move and a courageous move and a dangerous move. But if a small handful of people don't start doing it and then it grows and snowballs, like right now, you don't have legitimacy if you don't talk about violent crimes in the reform movement. You just don't. If you're a foundation, you cannot just fund nonviolent stuff. You just can't. Took us years, but at least you guys have a bit of a roadmap to look at to figure out how to turn this from moment to movement. A couple of weeks as I was preparing for this conference, I got a call from a guy named Michael. He said he saw me on the agenda for the conference. He was in his 30s, and he just called me on my cell phone. He said he Googled me and found my cell phone number. People who Google me usually find other stuff a lot worse than my cell phone number. And he said, I just need some help. And I was like, how can I help you? And he said, when I was 18, I got convicted of having sex with a 16-year-old girl. And he said, they gave me 4 years in prison, but they gave me 15 years parole, and that he's on the registry. And I thought he wanted to talk about employment or housing or healthcare or voting or something related to that, or even the registry. And what he wanted to talk about was his daughter, who's growing up, and he bought her an iPad, and she's going on the internet more and more. And she's Googling, and she's on YouTube and all this stuff. And he was just paralyzed with fear about her one day looking him up and seeing this information. I did not anticipate that call before today, but if I had any fear about being on the stage today and whether I could deliver anything that had value, like him calling me and helping me to just better understand another facet of this whole thing was just so important and unexpected, and gave me a lot more courage to be here. Howie, go back to Howie. So Howie, I've already told you the impact he's had on my life, continues to have in many ways. And Howie finally got out. Took him forever to get out. He got out. When he got out, I was reading the Albany Times-Union in prison. I was still locked up. And it was like, Howie, blah, 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 gets out of prison. He has a rape one conviction, and here's the story of what he did, and here's where he's living, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, oh, wow, Howie had a rape one conviction. I was like, but I love Howie. I love Howie. Like, Howie's done a lot for me, but Howie has a rape one conviction. But Howie was amazing. He's actually done more for me than almost anyone else in this facility. But Howie has a rape one conviction. Like, you hear that grapple? Like, I remember grappling with this issue even back then. And yet, Lance being able to stay in just leadership was about Howie showing up for me as a human being, about Howie being more than just what he had done and the time he had done. And then a year later, Howie came back. And I sat with Howie, and I asked him why he had never told me, and we had that conversation. And it was a difficult conversation for both of us, but I got to know him more as a human being. And what I got to know that really bothered me was that when he got out, he had to stay in a facility that was outside of his town with 80 other people who had sex offenses in that facility, and they couldn't go places, and they couldn't get jobs in places. And it was my introduction to the sort of wide array of just bullshit policies and practices that we have in place to keep people at the margins. And then Howie taught me some new yoga moves. I worry about Howie. I still think about him. In 2017, we're not going to have time for questions. How much time? I'm going to try to leave time for questions. 2017, I raised $43 million for Just Leadership. I'm kicking ass, taking names, doing my thing. I'm investing in my people. I got ideas for what's next. We're moving towards closing Rikers. We've trained 400 formerly incarcerated people. We have tens of thousands of people in membership. Foundations love me. Billionaires are meeting with me left and right. Zuckerberg gives me $8 million from a 15-minute meeting. Amazing. I'm subgranting money to other organizations. Because if there's anything I learned at Fortune Society, like, they made money because they were sort of sophisticated and knew what they were doing, but that's not a reason you should actually get more and more money. That just means you're good at writing proposals. So I never wanted to be the kind of organization that was good at writing proposals but not sharing with others. So I'd give a lot of money to other organizations, sometimes larger than foundations. And there was an organization I was working with, and it was run by a guy who I had done work on Rockefeller drug law reform with. And I gave them almost $1 million over 2 years. And in the middle of the second year, my staff started coming to me saying, look, they're heavy-handed, they're mean, they're not doing the kind of organizing we say we're going to do. I don't really want to keep working with them. And I got to be honest, I was so focused on closing Rikers, like I just wasn't paying enough attention to my staff. And then they started quitting. And then I realized we had a real problem. And so I kept sitting down with the guy who ran this other organization and in goodwill trying to sort of negotiate a different way to do business. And then it just got more and more tense because money's involved. And then finally we sit in this neutral meeting in Midtown Manhattan. And I come and I sit down and I say, I'm with my staff and they're with their staff. And I say, look, this is clearly not working. And I was like, with all due respect, like, we need to find a way to decouple us and not harm the movement to close Rikers. I said, I gave you $350,000 at the beginning of this year. I gave you $650,000 at the beginning of this year. You keep the other half, and at the beginning of next year, I'll give you $100,000 sort of walk money so that you guys will be okay. But we can't keep doing this. It's just harmful to the movement, harmful to my staff. And his co-founder gets up and he looks down at me and said, who the fuck do you think you are? Every penny you make to close Rikers, half of that is going to come to us. Every penny you make going forward, we're your partner. I don't care what the contract says. I tape recorded the conversation because I knew it was going to be a difficult conversation. We didn't end up agreeing on anything except to visit each other again in a week and try again because the conversation was so mean and difficult and just terrible. And instead of them meeting with us a week later, I started hearing murmurings that they were going to, quote unquote, ruin my career, get me out of the reform space, get rid of me. And if you know anything about black male leadership, if you want to get a black man out of leadership, yell rape. My contribution to it was I dated a lot of women in the field and had a lot of crappy relationships. It was 20 years. I take ownership over that. But it was the middle of the Me Too movement. And I started hearing about women that they were talking to who were willing to say things about me publicly. In fact, I heard they were going to come to a session like this and just show up in the back with signs and say, he's a Me Too guy, we got to get rid of him. The mumblings got louder and louder until one day I was sitting in a meeting and one of my staff members came in and pulled me out of the meeting. Anyone who knows me knows, don't interrupt me during meetings. Wherever I'm at is where I'm at. And she pulls me out and she says, Michelle, who used to work for us, told me that she just got offered money to say you sexually harassed her. That's when I knew I had a real problem. I was like, if they're paying people to do this, this is about to happen. So I go to a meeting later on that day, and the deputy mayor is in the room and walking around the room saying she's talking to the New York Times about a Me Too story about Glen. We don't have to worry about Glen anyway. He's going to be gone soon. That was her messaging. So I saw it coming. I don't know which parts of this I'm not supposed to talk about because of all the documents I had to sign. You guys understand what I'm saying? But I'm going to keep talking about it. And so I resigned, and I resigned to save the organization and to save the movement. I was like, if I leave, then at least when whatever it is hits, they can say, he's gone, he left. I don't take a piss without a strategy. I just knew that I was handling this the way it should have been handled. I could not have anticipated the raining down that happened to me over the next 12 months. And not by people who I didn't know. There was some of that. I don't care about that. They don't know me. But by people who I had worked with for almost 20 years in this space. People who literally would not even be in this space if it weren't for an investment I made in them or a space I created for them and with them. People who said they cared about justice, people who said they cared about due process, people who said they cared about second chances, people who themselves benefited from second chances. People called me predator, animal. Progressive criminal justice reform folks were referring to me publicly on social media with those words. That same balcony I sat on and looked at that concept paper for just leadership is the same balcony I kept thinking to myself every morning I should jump off of. I was suicidal. I was depressed. I was facing lawsuits. I was facing accusations. My whole world came tumbling down. But you know what I learned? That like human beings become stronger and better in the valley, not on the mountain. I spent time in that. When I found myself in that criminal justice reform field imposed incarceration, because that's what it was, I was like, this feels familiar. This feels like what the criminal justice system had for me. Oh, this is about human beings and how they show up when they hate someone, when they feel violated by someone, when they feel like their hero let them down. Don't be a hero. Don't be a hero. Be a fallible human being trying to do good work. Don't be the hero. Because when your hero lets you down, you show up in ways that are just disgusting. That's what I learned. But in that valley, it was really dark, and I heard some voices, a couple of them in this room. I see you. I see you. A handful of them in this room. And I just kept thinking, I know it's dark in front of you, but just take a step. Just take another step. And after a year of depression, therapy, suicidal ideation, I just started to get back up slowly and ask myself, you could spend time talking about what you didn't do, or you could spend time asking yourself what you contributed to get yourself to where you ended up. Because that's how you grow as a leader. That's how you grow as a human being. You can't control how other people behave. You can control how you show up. And I spent time trying to figure out what I contributed to that. And you heard some of it on the stage today. I had really crappy relationships. Because when I grew up in the streets, you know what? The more women you had, the more powerful you were. No one talked to me about how to treat women properly. So here I come into this movement and people are like, oh, poster child, perfect. He's not only black, he's fair-skinned, straight nose, handsome, easy to talk to. I just rode that wave. Rode that wave to $43 million for just leadership. Except I was sleeping with half my colleagues. I was ending relationships in really shitty ways. Get away from me, leave me alone. Blocked. So there was all this ammunition. And then the Me Too movement came along. And then this guy, Gabriel, was like, oh, I know how to get rid of this guy. And he was an organizer. He organized. I was trying to get the New York Times to give me a front page story for a long time. I can't believe the one I get is the one with me and a Me Too story. I never forget they told me just a few years earlier, you're an advocate, you're not really an expert. That's why we don't do stories on your work. So when you guys asked me to speak here today, I wasn't sure if I knew what I was going to talk about. But then I was like, we're all human beings. I'm just going to tell stories. But I'm going to sum it up. And I'm going to sum it up by going back to where I started, where I said the story of me, the story of us, and the story of now. I told you the story of me, tried to weave it into your journey so that there could be a story of us. But if there's no story of now, a sense of urgency, half by 2030, close Rikers, there has to be a sense of urgency. There has to be a sense that people need to motivate now and do something now. That's an important piece of it. So I am going to read for a second, actually. So in the process of building community that makes a whole greater than the sum of its parts, because that's the only way this works. If it's about any one of us alone, we don't have a movement. It's through community that we can learn to recast our individual interests as common interests. Identify values that we all share, and envision objectives that we can use our combined resources to achieve. But those objectives must be bold, they must be visionary, they must be expansive, and they cannot leave anyone under the bus. That has been the weakness of this movement from the beginning, is that there are people in the movement that are willing to either leave people under the bus or throw people under the bus. That's not a movement. That happens during the trajectory of a movement, so I'm not surprised by it. But that's not the kind of movement that breaks out, hits a tipping point, and has this room so filled that there's no seats left. Like, that's not how we get there. So a leadership story is first a story of self, a story of why I've been called. Some people say, I don't want to talk about myself. But if you don't talk about yourself, other people will talk about you. If you don't own your story, someone will tell your story for you. You have to find a way to go from the fear of your experience to telling your story in a way that helps people understand who you are and why you show up for this work. I could just be doing real estate. I figured out how to rebuild my life in 3 years. But then people will continue to tell a story about what happened to Glen in 2017. That's not your story, that's my story. I'm going to tell that story. I'm going to take my power back. You have to take your power back. You have to own your power, own your story, because someone will tell your story for you. And right now, policymakers are telling your story for you. And they're telling your story for you because it gives them political capital. It's always a win. Violent crimes, they were telling the story for us until we started telling our story. We made it so that no policymaker in this country could tell a story without remembering, damn, Glenn Martin is not that. Devon Pryor is not that. Eddie Ellis is not that. Michelle Turner is not that. The second is the story of us. And that's an answer to the question, why are we called? What experiences and values do we share as a community that call us to what we're called to? What is it about our experience of faith, public life, the pain of the world, and the hopelessness of the world? It's putting what we share into words. We've all been in places where people have worked together for years, but there is no us. Here, I get a sense of us just by walking through the hallways, but I think we have to expand how we define us. Finally, there's the story of now, the fierce urgency of now. The story of now is realized after the sharing of values and aspirations that the world out there is not as it ought to be. Instead, it is as it is, and that is a challenge to all of us. We need to appreciate the challenge and the conflict between the values by which we wish the world lived and the values by which it actually does. The difference between those two creates tension. It forces upon us consideration of a choice. What do we do about that? And we're called to answer that question in the spirit of hope. That's the other thing. Close Rikers gave hope to people. Even having one person, one thing, when I said we should close Rikers, people were like, how? And I would say, you know what? Let's not talk about land use before we talk about justice. Let's not talk about correctional facilities unless we talk about justice. But you know what I was saying in the back of my head? That if you can keep an idea alive long enough for at least one other person to say, what if? And then someone else to say it, that's how movements are built. That's how change happens. It takes a group of people to have a vision of the world that looks different than what we do today, and to believe that, as Margaret Mead said, a small group of people can actually change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. And you guys are no longer even a small group. There's a lot of you here. It's a great place to start. So our goal is to meet this challenge, to seize this hope, and to turn it into concrete action. I'm going to wrap this up and give a chance for at least one or two people to ask questions. This is the first time I'm standing on stage in about 4.5 years in front of a room of people that I don't really know. And, you know, it was scary. You know, on the way here, I got on the phone and talked to a few people, talked to some folks in the airport, really tried out my talking points, told some of these stories. You know why I'm saying this? Because people look at me on stage and they're like, oh, wow, he's good at what he does. I'm scared. Like, it's okay to be scared, is what I'm saying. And it's okay to say out loud that I'm scared. And it's often not rewarded in this space. But I can't imagine doing anything bold without having some healthy level of anxiety and fear about doing that. Otherwise, we're telling a lie or we're not being bold. So that's really what I want to leave you with, that the moments where your knees are shaking the most are the moments where you actually have to stand up and tell your truth. Even if everyone else is sitting down, that's how it works. I've done it for 20 years. I'm going to continue to do it. And I hope my stories today and my speech today will inspire and embolden you guys to do the same. On that note, I'd love to open it up for questions. I think we have about 8 minutes, maybe 7, 8 minutes.
Good morning, Glenn. I enjoyed every minute. I'm Cindy from Connecticut.
Thanks, Cindy.
And I know New York and Connecticut organizers, and that name is kind of unique. So we'll talk later. It's a public policy question I have. So for example, maybe, I don't know if it was 2 sessions ago, we were working on a clean slate bill in Connecticut. And of course, we get blindsided. It's all people, all people, all people, until read the fine print, excluding, violent, they break it down by the type of felony. But it basically includes sexual offense, because we're always elevated to, it's like arson, murder, sexual offense. And so our quote-unquote partners say in public hearings, look, we believe all people should get this, but if you're not going to include all people, still pass the bill. And it's like, how the heck are we ever going to get real reform if that's your story?
Yeah, thanks for that. So sounds like we have a friend in common. I just said his first name, Gabriel. I actually didn't want to be too controversial and say that his last name was Saya. Sayegh. Let me respond to your question. So I have been part of groups that do a lot of negotiating behind the scene and then a lot of speaking publicly. So I've experienced this on both sides. And what I would say is this: it starts with, I would argue, the foundations, even before the advocates. We can be really angry at the advocates, yes, and sometimes we should be. But foundations fund the work. It's sort of the gas in the tank, if you will. And foundations reward people for the quick win, for the transactional win, for the ability to come back and say, we did it, even if it's marginal, even if it's incremental. So if I were you guys, and in some ways I still am, I haven't gone anywhere, and if you read my Twitter account, you see me doing this all the time. I spend a lot of time holding the foundations accountable these days, to the extent that now they get on the phone with me and say, what can we do differently? So you guys are organizers, you're activists, you're advocates. Start thinking of philanthropy as part of who you engage. Because if you get them to show up differently in the RFPs that they put out and the way they give out dollars, then people start behaving differently. Always follow the money. Follow the money. Follow the money. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eric Jones. I'm from Marion, North Carolina, and I'm a peer support specialist, and I'll be dealing with the reentry of sex offenders specifically. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know, what do you do now what is your profession right now?
Yeah, so you weren't here in the beginning, I'm assuming.
No.
Okay, so I run a for-profit company that's a consultancy to about 8 nonprofits on any given day, helping people to go from a vision to brick and mortar, fundraising, crisis management, organizational development, executive coaching, and so on. But I'm also a real estate investor, and I have 92 properties in the South, Alabama, and Georgia, and I specifically put people with Section 8 and criminal convictions in my housing on purpose. So almost every property I own is a combination of Section 8 and people with criminal records, and I don't do carve-outs. Was there another part to your question?
I just like to network.
Don't ask me
with
for a
you.
donation. Is that what you're about to ask
No.
me for a donation?
Not yet. Not yet.
Sorry, the
But-
second part of your
But
question
no,
was?
I would just like to network with you
Yeah,
after,
cool.
after the program.
Okay, cool. At Glen E. Martin on Twitter, or catch me before I walk out the room. All right, it's good to meet you.
Hello, my name is Lee Booker. I'm from right here in Raleigh. I'm primarily a real estate photographer. I'm getting going pretty well in real estate photography now, and it looks like I'll have some extra money. It's been a goal and a dream of mine to have a type of self-improvement program for people who are on the registry. And I just want to know, what advice do you have as far as how do I get started? I have no idea what to do. I've just got this idea in my mind that it won't go away.
Yeah.
And I feel like if I don't do it, I've got maybe 20, 30 years left on this earth if I stay away from big trucks and take my vitamins. So, I really don't want this to go away,
Yeah.
and not be fulfilled.
All right.
Where do I start?
Okay, I'm going to give you $750 an hour advice. Grab your pen. Here's what I do with all my clients who start where you just articulated. You have to get it in writing. You have to put it down in writing. So create a 1 or 2 page document that sort of lays out your vision. If you can't figure out how to structure it, there's something we learned at Just Leadership called VPSA, Values, Problem, Solution, Action. What are your values that drive you to do this? What's the problem you're trying to address? What's the solution that you have? And what's the action you want people to take? So you can structure the document that way. Create a budget that shows what you would do if you had more money. So what would you do if the beginning of next year you had $300,000? How would you spend it? Because some people think and understand through numbers. And so you got to be able to tell the story through a budget. These days I tell people to create a deck. If you're over 35, I'm really talking about a PowerPoint, but a deck that sort of tells the story what you want to do, something sort of highly designed. And then think about other organizations that are doing similar work and start figuring out who's funding them. Maybe do a small gathering with your own friends so you can raise a little bit of money. And then ultimately going to foundations and saying, here's my vision. I've raised 10,000, I've raised 15,000, I've contributed my own 5,000, whatever. And I need you to come on and support this. And be ready for like 8 out of 10 foundations or even individuals to say no. That's part of fundraising, is you get turned down quite often.
Second part of my question, do you have any kind of coaching? Did I hear you say you had some kind of coaching program or something?
Yeah,
to
no, I
help
thought the
people?
second part of your question was going to be your address. I could send you my invoice. I do coach people. I don't take people's personal money for coaching. You have to have already raised money from a foundation. I want their money. I don't want your money. But if you call me, we can have a conversation.
Okay, do you have like a website or?
Yeah, gemtrainers.com. GEM, Glen Ernest Martin. I deliberately use GEM because people try to sully my name. So now all my businesses start with my name. Gemtrainers.com, because I'm not going to be shamed into disappearing. GEM.
Hello, my name's Kristen Powers. I'm the Executive Director of Benevolence Farm. We're in Alamance County here in North Carolina, and we support formerly incarcerated women coming home. And we're one of 2 organizations that does that for anyone, regardless of convictions. And so anytime a majority of our folks are on the registry. And I'm not really surprised by what government does to exclude people on the registry, but what I've noticed here in North Carolina is that a lot of other reentry organizations are doing that, whether it's direct service or advocacy. So I'm wondering if, as a reentry organization that does not exclude people, how can we bring in other reentry organizations into the fold and not exclude the people they're serving?
Thanks for that, and thanks for that, like literally you seeing that as something valuable. What we did many years ago started with a lot of sort of public space dialogue about this, a lot of panels at academic institutions, inviting people like me to the table, inviting these other, it's really creating a culture of you can't leave these folks out. And it is a little bit of, I don't like to use the word shaming because I'm really not a fan of toxic shame, but a little bit of shame sometimes goes a long way. And it's something to be said for like getting people on stage, having those folks in the room, having people like me say, how dare you? Like, you get money in my name. How dare you exclude me? So I would do much more public speaking. I think one last question, because I see Don standing and I know what that means. Last question.
Hi, Glenn. Mike McKay.
Yep.
You mentioned really early in your talk about the lateral conflicts that occur within a CJ reform sphere, similar to what we have. And NARSOL and our advocacy sphere is no stranger to that lateral conflict. But I never hear anyone discuss what the solution to that is, because you hear a lot of people in our movement say, well, why don't all of the organizations in this sphere just link hands and sing Kumbaya and fix everything? And obviously the answer is it's not that simple, but I'd be curious to see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm not surprised it exists in this space. I'm sorry that we even talk about this as a space outside of the larger criminal justice movement, the same way juvenile justice has always been aside from adult criminal justice reform. I think we need to bring all this together. But to your question, me coming up here on stage and opening up a door for that conversation, I think is important. I think we don't talk about it out loud enough. I think we don't say, like, this is what we deal with, and it's difficult, and we need to find a solution. I think that there are some people who are causing harm in all spaces. There are people who are just causing harm. Gabriel Saya, this guy causes harm. There are people who cause harm that we need to say, okay, you know, we need to figure out how to get you to the point where you're part of the movement in a way that lines up with our values. But my short answer to you, again, is just, I think that people fear having this conversation because they fear upsetting the funders, et cetera. I remember when I went to the Ford Foundation and said, I'm about to do a panel, I want to talk publicly about exactly this. And they said, no, there's other foundations in the room, you don't want to upset them, you want to let them know everything that's going well. It goes back to philanthropy. You got to go follow the money, but you got to also have these conversations publicly and create a restorative justice space where people are causing harm to get it right so that we can model for the rest of the world. But let's not just hide it and act as though it doesn't exist. And I know you don't do that. I watch you on Twitter. I find a lot of courage in what you do on Twitter, by the way. Keep doing what you're doing, and I hope that answers your question. Thanks, folks. Thanks again, Don. Appreciate it.